There must be changes. Let's skip the wheelchair ads going over the cliff and all that other stuff and say this. First and foremost, you have to take a look at people who are not drawing. If you're already in the system and you have a vested right to your benefits, then nobody, I don't think, is going to want to say, let's change it for those people. You need to take a look at actuarial reality and say, if you're going to be in 10 years, guess what? Maybe we're going to move that 10 years back to 12 years. Maybe we're going to move it back to 15 years for your eligibility. But we're not going to spring it on you. We're going to give you a chance to plan for that. And you go all the way back down the line to those younger Americans and say, by the time you get there, the eligibility age is going to be this, and the benefits are going to be this. And they need to be founded on principles that are sustainable, so when they plan on that, like the people that are already drawing, it will be there. And part of their plans, which they're entitled to rely upon. That discussion is phenomenally missing right now, with everybody trying to out-sensationalize the other in terms of, we're going to throw seniors out, although I think the seniors, you said, were going to throw us out if we didn't pay attention, so we're paying attention. And with that, I would say this, you need to start somewhere. And the only plan out there right now that is a starting place, please nobody leave the room without hearing these words, that is a starting place for the discussions, is Congressman Paul Ryan's plan. And you know why that's the starting place? Because it's the only plan that's been proposed. Thank you.
And Kurt, it's your turn.
When you take a look at those programs and what they do, there is no future for them given the current fiscal environment. Estimates today are that with those programs, we are between 60 and 100 trillion dollars with a T in unfunded obligations. They can no longer serve as funds that the government can use to touch. So first and foremost, you stop the government from going in and raiding any of those for any future unfunded programs whatsoever. For the people that are currently in the program, we don't want to see them cut off, it changed, or done anything, because they have paid into those programs. They have an expectation of what is there. The future, however, is not sustainable. It is going to require some very difficult, very truthful, very factual decisions by those that we elect and send back to Congress to sit down in rooms and honestly address the problem. Scare tactics are unacceptable on either side of the fence. It is not grandma under the bus or the grandchildren over the cliff, just like Mark said. The reality of it is we are going to have those hard discussions, because if we don't, we as a nation are failing ourselves, because it is our programs that we put into place as Americans because we believe in ourselves. We believe in taking care of some of the most vulnerable members of our society, of providing ourselves with a safety net. But unless we start looking forward on those and having transparency within the system so that Americans can understand what they're going to contribute, when they're going to contribute, and what they're going to get out of the system will not work. And right now, I don't feel Congress has been transparent with the American people in any of those programs. Otherwise, why would those unfunded obligations exist? Why would those programs be allowed? And we are going to need to look at them in total.
And back to Nancy.
Sometimes being first isn't the best thing.
Was the draw of the cards.
I know.
The bailout failed. The stimulus did not work. Unemployment continues to grow, and the housing market has lost extreme value. What do you think will turn this mess around? And that was submitted by Deborah.
Well, Deborah, I agree with some of what you said, but not all. I think this stimulus package helped a worse catastrophe. And I use the example of driving around this CD district last year and putting 8,000 miles on my car, most of it encountering roads being fixed and a lot of people working that wouldn't have been working under other circumstances. But in terms of the catastrophe that we are in, this is not a normal dip in the economy. This was a contrived fraud on the entire world, not just here at home. I'm underwater in my house, and I didn't get a subprime mortgage, but I did get an assessment or property amount on my house that was unreal under the circumstances. And the reason it was is because the banks were paying people. They were paying people to up the amount of the loan. The banks know, I thought in the old days, you know, the bank held some portion of this loan, but they don't. And they sold them off, rated them AAA and sold them around the world. This is not a normal dip in the economy. And what we need to do is recognize that and deal with it. First and foremost, prosecute the people who did this to us and the rest of the world. And it'll set an example so those kinds of things will not happen again. But the first and most important thing is put back the Glass-Steagall Act.
And Mark, it's your turn.
Thanks, Karen. You know what, you have to start out with the recognition that it is the private sector that pays for the public sector. So when you talk about bailout, stimulus, unemployment, and housing, you're talking the first two things about what the government does, and the last two things are what you need for the private sector to rebound with. And so when you talk about bailout and stimulus, when you talk about approximately $4 trillion that's been expended, and where we are here in Nevada and where we are here in the country, and knowing that those two things require tax dollars to accomplish, and they require tax dollars at a time when the private sector is sick, financially speaking, and that's put gently. So it's a cultural issue first and foremost, and that is you have to promote the private sector for that health. You have to create jobs. Jobs will produce people that will buy houses, can afford houses. That will produce a housing market where people aren't underwater again. So you have to have a cultural divide first and foremost and say, what do we do in the private sector? And I would submit to you that what you don't do in the private sector in the situation that this country and this state is in right now is generate programs that require trillions of dollars more federal money to fund, because government jobs have to be paid for by the private sector. You must create private sector jobs first. So when you talk about what is the solution is not tax increases. The solution is not more debt. The solution is not more regulation. The solution is not more restrictive land use policies in a state and in a county which the vast supermajority of all the acres are federally owned. You have to let the private sector go and allow those entrepreneurial things. And we had talked for just a minute about corporations. When you look at the statistics, it's the smaller business entities that generate those jobs. So you have to get down to that level and say, how do we encourage those people to come back? Because they're the ones who are hiring in Pahrump. They're the ones who are hiring in Tonopah. They're the ones who are hiring up and down the state. So that's where the focus ought to be from the federal level.
And Kirk, it's now your turn.
When you look at what the stimulus attempted to do and the trillions of dollars that we poured into it, it essentially turned into a bank bailout. It did not turn into what was going to actually move the economy, stimulate the economy, and get the jobs out there. Here we are right now with an administration, with a president who says he's not concerned that there might be a double dip in the recession. That's an unacceptable compromise to the folks out here in Nevada who are suffering anywhere from 12 to 20% unemployment. We can't afford it here at home. This state is hurting and continues to hurt, and we are going to have to do what's necessary. But it is going to be the private sector that does it. We as a nation can no longer afford to say a corporation, a company, or an entity is too big to fail. Too big to fail is an excuse for doing nothing. Too big to fail is an excuse for spending your hard-earned tax dollars to help out a corporation who was irresponsible in how they organized and spent money to operate. We can no longer afford to do that. And if they fail, guess what? That doesn't mean they shut the doors and everyone's put out of work. That means they're given an opportunity to reorganize under bankruptcy laws, keep people employed, restructure how they do business so that they can continue to provide those jobs that allow people to stay employed, to afford their homes, to contribute to the tax base so that that private sector can continue to grow, so that it can fund that public sector as it needs to provide. But the reality of it is the public sector must become smaller. Less government is better government. And in the private sector, they are more than capable of running what's necessary where the government today feels an obligation and a right to intrude where we do not need it.
And now we have to take a short commercial break, and we're going to be right back with more of your questions for our candidates. You have a 2-minute time frame if you need to get up and stretch.
Don't melt out your sugars. You can't keep trying to sort it out. That's what I like.
And we are back. I told you it wouldn't take too long. And we're going to continue on with the questions that you have submitted for the candidates. They have not seen them, so we're seeing how well they think on their feet. All right? Are you ready?
I'm ready.
I know, Nancy's first, and she's ready. Please give the audience your best stump speech on why the people should elect you to the U.S. Congress to represent the great state of Nevada. And that was submitted by the Trump chicks.
Well, I don't really have a stump speech, but let me tell you why I think I'm the best candidate. Back there, you'll have a brief overview of my background. I think in terms of my education, my experience, I have the most breadth and depth. Probably because I'm the oldest, but still in all, I have the best breadth and depth. Education-wise, my degrees include public policy, public administration, and journalism. So I know what to look for in those areas. I was an elected regent for 6 years. I know the politics of education and how tough that can be. I was in the military for 24 years. I retired as Chief Master Sergeant, and I could not be an officer because I was 34 when I joined, so I went to basic training with the 17 and 18-year-olds. So I know how to handle kids too. There's a number of things, I don't know here if this is good, but I'm married to Bob Price, I mentioned earlier, who was in the legislature for 28 years. And I like to say if Hillary Clinton can get credit for being First Lady, I